Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Heartwell dev stream, the live stream series where we continue to develop this adorable Souls-like action RPG with platforming mechanics and branching narrative. And if you find these dev streams interesting or helpful, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and boot that bell button to stay notified. Now, in the previous dev stream, it was all about working towards the Cobra rework, and we've made some good progress. So right now, the Cobras can behave independently of one another for the most part. However, there are some bugs left over from trying to change the damage calculations, and we're going to work to try to either resolve those bugs today or proceed with a rework of the damage calculations. Hello, Copper Nicholson. Thanks for dropping by. How's it going? Welcome, welcome. Alright, fair enough, Copper Nicholson. No worries. Hope you have a good rest of your night. As I was saying, so tonight's going to be very much focusing on reworking damage calculations. As you'll notice, if I attack this, we get the crit sound, which is, first of all, not correct. And second of all, we attack some of the other enemies, we don't end up with much in the way of damage at all. All of which is to say that this does need a bit of a re-examination or rework in terms of how damage is calculated and assessed to each of these individual cobras. So, it's going to be primarily a thought process and debugging stream tonight, or a programming stream. Hey, KK Sparks, thanks for dropping by. How's it going? Ooh, you're working on a comic together with character slips. That's really awesome. What's the comic about, KK Sparks? Right, so the first thing I'll be doing is, as I noted at the end of last stream, I'm going to quickly double-check the Rattlesnake and Cabrattle's damage calculations code to see the differences between that and the new Cobra calculations code. I have a hunch that the only difference is going to be the use of the for each object, and that's probably causing some issues with the save file array process. But if that's not the case, then hopefully that's an easier bug to resolve, and is the case, then I think we'll be better off proceeding with a rework. Hey, Demiro, thanks for dropping by. How's it going? At 2 AM, you're watching the stream. Aww. Alright, no worries, Demiro. I wish you all the best with any good night's sleep, but I'm happy to have you here. But yeah, this is, right now we're working on some debugging for basically damage being dealt to particular enemies, in this case, the Cobra enemy. So, since I don't think you've been around some of the previous dev streams, Demiro, it's been an interesting challenge trying to get these Cobra enemies to behave individually, since Fusion 2.5 can really struggle with getting different instances of objects to behave independently of one another. So you'll notice in this case, all of these Cobras can each move to their own separate... They all behave independently of each other, which is good. Now, the animations aren't quite fully programmed yet, but that's not the point. The point is that they're able to behave independently of one another and pathfind independently of one another, as you can see here by this test. Ooh! A bits of My Hero Academia and Harry Potter. Nice. Sounds like a cool concept, KK Sparks. Be interested to hear where it goes. Our focus tonight is on damage calcs, like I said, which means we should be looking here. At first glance, let's see. With the new update to the engine, you believe it will make individual object separation much easier. Oh, do tell, Demiro. I'm not. I haven't been keeping up with some of the updates. Might be interested to hear about that, because object separation is definitely one of the larger challenges with Fusion 2.5. Okay. So obviously I'm noticing here that there are different sasses being written. And how does that compare to Cabrattles? Let's see here. Dash Titan. Oh, test them since the new UI, so customizing the colors of the editor. That's fun. That's a fun update. I approve. I approve. Okay. Oh, let's look at the melee damage station. Interesting. Oh, yeah, Demira. So, for context, there's thousands of lines of code already for Heartwell. And this is all, just the framework. But yeah, the reason it's so long is because every enemy needs so many different calculations for all the different types of damage. This is an RPG after all. So, there's a lot going on here. I'm not so worried about the amount of code as I am about making sure that the code actually works. Which seems obvious, but that's very important. Alright, so I'm not noticing an immediate difference between the code beyond the indexing value, and that's something that's not easily fixed. So, you'll notice, chat, again, for testing purposes, I'd also encourage everyone to be careful about their ears, because I know one of the Cobras, at the moment, if we try to do a melee attack on them, it's going to cause, well, just pure sadness. So, yep, and there it is, that's pure sadness. That's a Cobra that's taking no damage whatsoever. And this is a Cobra that will destroy us. Whoops. One second, chat. Yeah, Cobras in their current forms are pretty unforgiving for melee distance, so I might want to change that. So yeah, first of all, damn crit, which is not how it's supposed to work. And that did double the amount of damage it ought to have, which is strange, because I saw it say 20, even though it clearly took 40. So... I'm back. Well, Copper, that's because it's a bug. It's not supposed to be like that. So, and that's just the crit sound effect at the moment, but that's that. First of all, that should not be a crit. As you look at our melee weapon right here, we currently have a crit rate of 0%, and we do not have the status effect active, so that should not be happening. Oh, it was dealing 30, which meant it was dealing double damage. Okay. I do wonder, did I accidentally leave the crit? No? Yeah, no, it's not active. Okay. Exactly, I must fix the VODs. So, as it currently stands, we have two kind of options here. One option is to mess around with this code and in the hopes that we can fix it to work with admittedly complex and a complicated previous damage calculation system, or we could do what I think will be more beneficial in the long run and start pursuing a rework, because the old code uses calculations for how status effects worked in the previous iteration, which was the idea of building up a status bar that would then activate some kind of effect temporarily, and that has a whole host of complications into it that makes it very difficult to program. And the plan moving forward, as we noted in our DevStram notes, is to switch to status effects being just a passive thing that doesn't have a build-up, but it's kind of more in the background sort of thing. Since that'll require less objects to pull off, and would also, I think, make the calculations a bit easier. So, chat, it means it's time to do some math. Yes, you heard that right, chat. This is secretly just an algebra stream. But in all seriousness, we are going to have to do a lot of algebra because we have to come up with the new calculations and thought process for how damage is dealt. So, my understanding with how things currently work, chat, with my previous damage calcs, is that we first check if the enemy gets hit by an attack. That then has, as soon as the enemy is hit by the attack, all the enemy's necessary stats, so fire resistance, flame buildup, etc., gets sent directly to an array where it is saved. And then, after that information is saved in the array does its thing in the background, and then spits out the amount of damage that should be taken. And once the damage is taken, you retrieve the information from the array to write to the Cobra. And also, there's some code to actually display how much damage was taken. Now, that concept of saying the information to one central source and then applying it back, you might say, Antomicx, why do it that way? Why not do it for every individual enemy? Well, that's because the calculations, by and large, are going to be the same no matter what enemy is taking damage. However, the values that are input into that function, shall we say, are going to differ. And one of the challenges with Fusion 2.5 is that for having different objects active objects to represent different enemy types. If I had to, for whatever reason, rebalance how the calculations work for damage in the future, and it's done for every single enemy, that means I have to edit a bunch of different equations. Whereas if I have one central function, I only have to edit the one function if I need to do some rebalancing. And in general, when I'm developing Heartwell, especially lately, I try to take the effect of assume you're going to have to edit it in the future Antomicx. So make sure things are centralized. So I still like the idea of sending the information to a central place. I don't know if we should necessarily use an array, though. Because with an array, you have to actually save the information before you can use the calculations. So you might not necessarily be able to do that on the same line. And I'm not sure if we could possibly fit the information elsewhere. So let's just first describe a new concept for this. New damage calculation concept. Follows a check for if the enemy has taken damage from a melee attack or a ranged attack. Since it is theoretically possible for an enemy reptile melee swipe at the same time. Activate a flag. The enemy's damage taken recently. Flag. For the attack that it received. Then the enemy's relevant stats to a secondary object to an intermediate active object. Oh, by the way, Demiro, if you're still here, do you know of any, we'll say, types of active objects that can store more than 32 variables in Fusion 2.5? Because if you do, I think that'd be a very useful object to use in this particular context, because it'll make upscaling this idea easier. Where the enemies where the player's damage enemies health this affects build up calculate the damage that the enemy should take. Once written, activate a flag to indicate that a damage calculation. Intermediate objects. Okay. Well, if that's how you're feeling, Copper, you're always welcome to leave and take a nap, dude. I don't do what works best for you, dude. Anyway. So what I'm thinking is using the values to calculate the damage the enemy should take using the stored values. Determine if any of the enemies so that the bill of values should increase, and if so, increase send the deactivate the flag in the intermediate object. And damage calculation is complete. If damage taken is greater than damage received, greater than the enemy's resistances. Value if damage taken is less than or equal to these relevant resistances, then subtract these, then write a value of 0 in the damaged out value. And then top up, that's how you feel. Just, you can always leave and go to sleep, dude. You should do what works best for your body. And I'd also ask you to refrain from cursing, dude. We have chat rules. Please follow them. Alright, no worries, stop predictables then. Have a good night. Alright, so we deactivate the flag. Step 6. Subtract the and display enemies. The health bar. If the enemies so I think that's the main thing. If the enemy took frostbite or burn damage, do you want to show an additional counter for that? We could either show and incorporate the extra damage. Alright, for those who are still in chat, question time. So, for context, the way that frostbite and burn damage works in the rework is that there's a percentage of there's a percentage of the enemy's max health that's dealt if an enemy takes fire or frostbite damage. And my question to you all is, should that damage be a separate counter that appears on screen just to show that that damage is being dealt, or should it just be kind of rolled into the damage taken overall? I personally lean towards rolled into the damage taken overall. Oh, hey, taste parts. So, under normal circumstances, if an enemy takes damage, a little counter appears that shows how much damage they've taken. So if they took 20 damage, you'd see a little 20 pop up briefly and then disappear. In the current rework, the burn and frostbite statuses each would deal an additional amount of damage that's like a set amount. So it might be like maybe 1% or something of an enemy's health. So the damage that's caused by that, we'll say status, so whether that's frostbite or burn, also have a separate counter to indicate that it's occurring, or should it just be rolled into the normal damage counter? I can see pros and cons to each of these. The pro of the just rolling it into the overall damage taken is that that's easier to program. But the pro of having a separate counter for it is the separate counter might be more visually pleasing and indicative of different things. At the same time, though, having more counters means we're using more active objects, and that can cause that'll make things a little less optimized. I personally lean more towards just setting it up where it's just rolled into the damage itself. So that way it's less active objects, and also doesn't make them those status effects stand out in a strange way compared to the other status effects where you don't see a counter. So you're saying... Well, the thing is, Tay-Tay's parts, down some context. So we already have a regular old damage counter, so I'll show you that right here. Boop. See? Damage counter. So that's how it looks normally. What's the status effect would look like is, imagine having a second counter pop up beneath the first one to also show some damage. So it might be red if it were fire, or blue if it were frostbite. So the difference is the former is easier to program. Like, I know how to program the other damage counters to appear like that. It's just I am trying to move away from having multiple damage counters and things like that, since that made the system a bit overly complex. Does that make sense? So again, all of this is still staying. It's just a question of how status effects would apply. And again, this is... I know we're talking so much about status effects when I know for certain that it's not applicable for the demo. The only status effects that one could theoretically use in... Well, I mean, the only elemental damage type that the player could possibly get in the demo is light, because fists have one very particular special that actually gives it some light damage. But light actually heals the player, so it's not particularly relevant for this. Yeah, alright. I'll go with the lighter. That's what I thought. Thanks, Tay-Tay Sparks. But yeah, with light, you're not actually... The effect is that the damage you're dealing with light actually is recovered as health. So that's still the same. I've always liked that idea for light. So, alright. In that case, we will go with the more optimized idea. Current plan into the overall damage taken. And that way, you know, if someone does start to add a little bit of fire damage or a little bit of ice damage to their weapon, they'll notice immediately the additional damage. It'll be obvious, because what was previously doing, you know, who knows, maybe like 10, a certain amount of damage is now doing a little bit more because of the elemental stuffs. Oh yeah, Copper Nicholson, Wi-Fi's working. Also, how does the artwork, Tay-Tay Sparks, with you and your friend working on that comic? So yeah. Other... It do not need a... This will remove the need for the... No, we heard you, Copper Nicholson. Alrighty. That's the new damage calculation concept. Now I think we need to actually write out what the calculation is, based off how the new stats effects work. No artwork yet, as you're just coming up with the names and bios for 3 main characters. Ah, fair enough, Tay-Tay Sparks. Yep, so in other words, you're world building. That's really cool. Yeah. I do a lot of world building for Heartwell as well, so I have documents dedicated to the story and lore and things like that. And I will not be showing those documents on stream because of spoilers for obvious reasons. But it all adds up. That's all very important. So first, some basic equations as a reminder. So critical hit check is equal to... So what the critical hit check does is it determines whether or not critical hit bonus damage is applied for a particular hit. Critical hit bonus damage applies when so first we'll list calculations. They'll very much mirror how this works. So we have floor critical hits is we'll say is critical hits is equal to floor random 1,000 one sec, chat. I realized I clicked the numpad and sometimes that opens up for random tabs. Random 1,000 plus value 26 to save file number. I know that value is right. That value is the current critical hit. Well, actually, it depends on whether we're doing range or melee. So for melee, the value is 24. Plus, we'll say critical hits value of current weapon. Sorry, critical hit chance of current weapon. Plus alright, and this is where the things have changed a little bit. So this is how we need to think of how the new surge is going to work. So previously, the way this equation was set up is it was checking whether surge buildup is active, and if it was, then it would say, basically, yeah, guaranteed crit. But that's not what we're doing here. For context, this comic and your best friend's characters within it were all just hers. When you first met, it was awkward because you were both shy. Then that freshman year wore on, she noticed you did Ruby and Soul Eater character drawings, and she showed me her characters. Yes, so click that way. Aw, that's very sweet. It's cool when you meet friends who are, I mean, when you meet people with common interests and they, you know, they develop into friends. That's very good. Also, let's see. I haven't actually watched Soul Eater. Have I? No, it's not ringing a bell. For a second there, I thought you said Demon Slayer. Definitely, he enjoys Demon Slayer. That's a really excellent show. But I don't think I've seen Soul Eater, though. Well, I've certainly seen Ruby, though. But yeah. Previous calculation was basically a check to see whether or not surge buildup was active. Whereas now, the way it works is surge is... Where did I put those? Yeah. Oh, I actually put a little note here. Okay, here it is. Oh wait, no, that is the new equation, isn't it? Okay, all stats available values shall be between 0 and 1,000 inclusive. Okay, I see. So that is actually the new equation. Well, it does make sense. Players finds Zane, though it needs full amount of Acronyms Brotherhood treatment. Fair enough, fair enough. You're based off the Game Grumps, actually. Oh, that's amazing. Yes, so much yes. They must be hilarious characters, then. Yeah, I think this general concept here will work. The idea of min enemy surge stats build up 1,000. So that basically just guarantees that it will never exceed 1,000. And you might be saying, Antomicx, what the heck is this equation? What does it even mean? What this is basically, the first part of this equation, chat, is random 1,000, and that generates a random number from 0 to 999 inclusive. Now, by defining that by 1,000 and using a floor value, that floor basically just means round down. Or not round down, it's truncate down, which means unless the value, if the value isn't like a whole number, it will go to the lowest next value. So let's say I had a value of 0.999, that actually rounds down to 0 because of the way truncating works. But if it were a 1.0001, it would just truncate down to 1. Once picked, it says the others. The John Chase says, when you withdraw them, you'll let people guess who is based on who. Yes! Amazing! They'll never know. That'll be the subject of debate for years to come. It'll be hilarious. I'm sure the Game Grumps will approve. But anyway, what this essentially does is, if the critical hit chance of a weapon is 0, and the enemy surge stats build up on an enemy is 0, then it is impossible to get a critical hit. However, if the critical chance of a weapon is even 1, then it will most certainly be a critical hit. Well, it's even 1, then it has a chance of being a critical hit. That's based off percentages. So basically, a 1 in critical hit chance is about 0.1% chance. Speaking of which, I do need to double check on the amount of... Yep. I need to double check on just what the critical hit, how the critical hit calculation works. Or just what the value is, whether it's a 0 value or a value of 1,000. Okay, so it is a value of 1,000. Understood. Perfect. That actually makes this a lot easier. Okay. So in this particular idea, it's basically saying if an enemy is building up the surge stats build up, you're basically just adding to the critical hit chance, which is a good thing, because the higher that goes, the more likely you're dead to crits, the more likely you're to do an insane amount of damage, and the player's happy. So that's how we do critical hits. I think the next major check is going to be this will actually affect damage resistances. So damage resistances determines how much determines how resistant an enemy also calculation intermediate much. No, we should do that elsewhere. How an enemy's resistances are applied for the damage calculation. Yeah, I say, Antomicx, why do you need to calculate what an enemy's damage resistances are? Isn't that a fixed value? Not quite. And the reason it's not is because of the fault line status. So, as I've written here in this idea, enemy damage resistances is equal to the max enemy damage resistance times a ceiling of 1,000 minus enemy fault line buildup, comma 0. And what that means, chat, what this equation basically does is it's checking whether or not it's checking what the multiplier is for how much damage an enemy's taken. So if you think of 1,000 as 100.0%. So if fault line buildup is 0, it's the normal damage resistances. But if the fault line is built up at all, then you're actually reducing the enemy's resistances, which means the player's dealing more damage because the enemy isn't resisting as much of it. To that end, enemy damage resistances is equal to enemy damage resistance times ceiling 1,000 minus enemy fault line buildup, comma 0. This ensures the surge mass effect can build up the chance that the player deals a critical hit to the enemy. This ensures that the enemy takes these resistances are weakened by the fault line buildup. No worries, KJ Sparks. Ooh, strawberry shortcake is very good. Did you get it from a local bakery? Alright, so that'll do for basic damage resistances. Next is going to be bonus damage. Bonus melee damage. And bonus range damage. Since we, once again, this is another stats thing. So melee comes from water, and so the Riptide SAS and the ranged bonus damage comes from wind, so the headwind status. So is raised from the Riptide status buildup. Oh, you made it yourself, actually. That's awesome. You made it with Sara Lee pound cake, whipped cream, and fresh cut strawberries. Sounds delicious, cake taste parts. Hope you enjoy. Yep. So, enemy melee damage taken. And this is very much the same. Okay. And this is basically ensuring that it can be up to a 25% bonus if this is at 1,000, or it's... I think I'm actually going to need to use another check here. So floor, enemy Riptide buildup, comma, 1,000. And then this is just to ensure that if the build-up happens to be higher than 1,000, it's not going to be problematic. Yep. And finally, we have the overarching equation. Which is going to be overall damage dealt. That's it. Should probably say this is enemy max range damage. Taken. I'll have one for range as well. Overall melee damage taken is equal to So with these, I'm actually going to take the equations. Well, first I'll do a simplified equation. So simplified written out. And this is because I want to try and use as few lines as possible. And that means trying to put more values on the same line. So, simplified version. Overall melee damage taken is equal to enemy max melee damage taken. Actually, no. I need to do this for every damage type because they're all different. I'm gonna actually have to. Now I'm thinking that we have to rethink how this works. So we determine resistances. We have our critical hit shit. We're also including the damage dealt by different elemental types. Yeah. So we'll have a player manually damage dealt is equal to damage dealt minus physical resistance. Damage multipliers from weapon specials. Yeah, so you have an is low HP threshold, so that's an interesting thing. Fire resistance. Damage dealt. Alright. This might actually be a decent spot to take your first break, chat, so don't worry, guys. I'll be right back. Alright, chat, welcome back everybody. To answer your question, KJ Sparks, did I make the Heartwell Be Right Back screen myself? Yes, I did. So, every piece of artwork you see on my Twitch channel, or like the Be Right Back screen and the end of stream screen, I made all of that myself. It's just a pretty simple little GIF, really. First, you make the logo and the outline, and then you just have a little animation for the two icons to go back and forth. Nothing super complicated. So yeah. Oh, I gotta chat something real quick. Sorry, chat. Okay. Anywho, so we're cooked up. So the thing is, when I tried to make like the damage delta equation, put all the things, the various variables in here at once, it did seem to have some, I think I had some trouble with that. But we shall see if we're able to fit them all in now that they're all calculated ahead of time. Let's see here. Ready? So bud business, you're just saying they aren't so as easy as they make it out to be. Really depends on the bud, KK Sparks. Sometimes it can be as simple as you forgot to comment and enter out a line of code. And other times it can be super complicated because you've adjusted certain ideas, fundamental concepts in your code, and now previous frameworks no longer work or it doesn't jive correctly. So what I'm doing right here isn't so much of a bug fix as it is a rework. But The thing is, this rework would have had to have been done eventually anyway. It was just a question of whether it would be done before the demo or after the demo. And I'm thinking at least the basis of this rework needs to be done before the demo. And by basis, I mean just the damage calculation portion of it. So that's... I'm basically taking these parts. I'm taking this as an opportunity for pursuing something that'll be beneficial in the long run, even if it'll take more time up front. So that's why I'm writing this out, to help me understand the damage equations. Range damage. I'm also now realizing that with these damage deltas, it's actually going to have to be... we'll have to do some min equations, so this actually will look a bit different. So max... Now, be saying, Antomicx, why is this necessary? Is this overkill? No, it's not. Because if we didn't have this mass equation here, what would happen is resistances that perhaps a weapon doesn't deal, that the enemy happens to resist. So let's say the enemy resisted lightning damage, but the player uses a weapon that doesn't deal lightning damage, then you effectively just have a negative multiplier add, and that doesn't make any sense. Have I ever looked at the program Yandere similar? You watched... Oh yeah, there was a lot of complicated nodes, which all could be done with easier methods. There are also lock coding. Where was from what I apparently... I see, take this parts. Yeah, well, that's the thing. There's all... In general, with programming, there's almost always a better way to do things if you have more time to think about it and optimize it. I mean, this is a prime example. So these calculations I'm doing right here... a lot of them follow a similar idea to what they were before, but they used to be a bit more complicated due to how the damage framework used to work. And the other thing I'm noticing is that this does not account for critical hits. So, currently we're just... you're able to understand this code more than the Antomicx. That's good, because I want this to make sense. There's I mean, it is a lot of algebra, but there is a logic to it. There is an end result here. But as I'm looking at this, again, the more I look at this, the more I realize, like, oh yeah, I need to include this thing and this thing. So we have a critical hit damage calculation, that's great. But now we have to calculate max damage dealt. Applies for each damage type. Alright, I realized we actually have to move this bonus damage actually earlier. So if we think of this logically, we need to know what the bonus... Well, no. Okay, we need to have a single, like, bonus damage multiplier, I think. Which then can be applied... well, it's an apology point. Alright, well, I take that as an even better compliment. So the fact that this is making sense even to someone with no programming experience, I think that's good. Okay, so... Right now I'm trying to think in my head of the best way to outline this, because the thing I'm noticing is I want to make it so that if a player's damage would normally not break an enemy's damage resistance, let's say a player does 40 melee damage for physical, but the enemy has 50 physical resistance, and they happen to get a crit. If we just apply this logic right here, as is, it doesn't quite work, because if the base physical, like if the base damage doesn't break the resistance, then it doesn't matter if the statuses help you overcome that. So that means we'd actually need multiple values for damage, max damage dealt. Oh. Yo, Grekor, thanks for dropping by. How's it going? Yep, no worries, Grekor, no worries. Right now, Grekor, we are working on a rework to damage calculation. You might say, Antomicx, wasn't supposed to be a debugging stream. It was originally. But I realized that we're going to I'm going to have to do this eventually anyway. It was just a question of whether or not I should debug the code now, just have the demo out, and then work on a rework later, or work on the rework now. And I'm thinking it's probably better to work on the rework now, at least in regards to damage calculations, because changing how stats effects works is unquestionably going to affect the damage calculation code. So if I can get that working here, I think that would be beneficial overall. And then, of course, once the base rework is in there, then in the future I could fix how the damage counts work for the rattlesnakes and the cabrattles. But that could be after the demo, because currently the damage counts are working for them with the old method. But to that end, Rework, as you can see, we're doing a lot of planning right now, because with damage calculations, you can't play around with this. You really need to outline it very, very carefully. But that's what I'm up to, Rework. What are you up to? Oh, with your coding. Okay, what I think we should do to keep this nice and simple . So we have the critical hit check, and we have the bonus melee damage. Ooh, that's awesome, Rework. Got any examples that really piques your interest, and you're like, yes, this is really cool, I like this. So what I'm thinking we do is we have our bonus melee damage, we have our critical hit check. Max damage applies for each damage type, so max damage dealt physical is equal to player physical damage dealt times 1.0. You might say, why would I multiply it by 1? To make sure that it gets converted into... Well, actually, no, we'll do that anyway if it's multiplied by a decimal. Or we should do rounds. Player physical damage dealt times... is critical hit. Hit bonus. 1,000.0. And that will give us our multiplier. Times, and this is where the bonus damage comes into play. Damage taken, no. Okay. melee damage bonus. I really don't. I had no idea about that. Well, in that case, that's that's a great way to get some good practice in. We'll have the melee damage bonus. Divided by actually, no, I don't think we have to divide here because we have the raw damage dealt. Here's an 1,000. Then divide by 1,000. Multiply by the melee damage bonus. And yep. Yo, the Arch guy, thanks for dropping by. How's it going? It's going pretty well here. We're right now working on basically a damage calculation rework, and we're writing out the basic idea for it at the moment. So that's the mat's ranged damage dealt. Yeah, what's new with you, the Archguard? Relative to that melee and range damage bonuses. Melee and range damage dealt. Oh, also very interesting. Awesome. Glad you think so. This is a very important step. Oh, nothing much. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, sure. But yeah, basically what this is pseudo-code explaining the premise behind each of these damage calculations. And it's generally going in order. So we check our critical hit, we check our bonus damage, then we check how much damage is dealt for each element. Honestly, now that I'm looking at this, it might be easier. Sure, the Irish guy. Let me get my thought across real quick. It might be easier to set the to check for the resistances actually here before we get to damage dealt, since that might make that later calculation easier, and so that might actually fit in the editor, because the editor can only handle equations that are so long before it says, hey, you can't make this. So we'll do roundup of that. I promise the art style that's an explanation of how damage types work inside. I just want to finish this thought. So max 0 minus Max enemy damage resistance. Okay, so general overview of how damage types work in this game. I think it's actually easier to pull up the game editor to explain this. Okay, so what you're seeing here is the screen for the melee stats. There are 8 damage types in this game: physical, fire, earth, electric, wind, water, ice, and light. So those are the 8 damage types. Every enemy, every entity that can be damaged in Heartwell, including the players themselves, have damage resistances. And damage resistances are, you know, how much the enemy resists taking damage of a certain type, so physical, fire, earth, etc. At the moment, the way enemy damage resistances work is it is... Actually, wait a minute. I'm realizing that the way I've currently set up enemy damage resistances, it's kind of like in Pokemon where you subtract like defense from attack and so on and so forth, some old RPGs. I might want to change that to percentage based, like what we have with Dorothy, since that still lets players use damage types they prefer, but it also disincentivizes damage types that we'll say are not particularly effective in certain enemy types, but that's changed the list. The idea is you have different damage types, and the basic premise is you subtract the damage type from the corresponding damage resistance, and if it's greater than 0, then of course the enemy takes damage. If it's less than or equal to 0, then the enemy doesn't take damage from that particular damage type. So if I had an enemy with, well, I'll say I have a 20 physical melee attack, and the enemy has a damage resistance for physical of 10, you'd subtract the 20 from 10 to get the overall damage dealt. I'm thinking of changing that to a percentage, but that's I guess a subject for debate. However, obviously with Heartwell, because you know this is an RPG with a lot of upgrades and things like that, it's not as simple as, oh, well, you just subtract physical from, you know, damage type resistant from resistance type, and that's the end. And that has to do with, well, first the specials, which might affect how much damage you're dealing with certain types in certain situations. You can get critical hits. So if, let's say I was doing a physical attack against an enemy that also has 20 physical damage resistance, normally that would do nothing. However, suppose I happen to get a critical hit, then I would apply the critical hit multiplier to the damage dealt. So enemies can have affinity with melee range as well as elements. Great question, the Arch Guy. In general, I would keep it just damage overall is identical. The reason I separate melee and range damage calculations is because it is quite possible that a player hits the same enemy with a melee and a ranged attack at the same time. So crits get factored in. Crits actually get factored in before resistances, and the reason that is because you could easily end up in a situation where you might not deal any damage normally, but if you got a crit, you would actually deal damage. At least on the current system. In the newer idea for a system, it would be more so, well, if the enemy has 100% damage resistance to something, you're not hitting that unless you lower damage resistances. So yeah, crits get factored in, but the point is crits have to get factored in to your damage type up front, in addition to bonus damage. You might say, what do you mean bonus damage, Antomicx? Well, in the status, there are different status effects build-up rates here, and in the rework, status effects are like a passive thing that builds up over time with additional hits. It doesn't like get get reduced over time, shall we say, like it used to. So it's like a slow build-up of power. And in this case, I will draw attention to Headwind and Riptide. So what Headwind does is, for every point of Headwind buildup that an enemy has, the player deals a little bit more range damage. Where if the max buildup is 1,000, and if you get to 1,000, then the player is dealing an additional 25% ranged damage. So let's say and the same thing goes with Riptide, except Riptide applies for melee damage. So let's say I have an enemy that I've built up 1,000 Riptide buildup on. I hit them with a melee attack that happens to be a critical hit. Now, in addition to the base 20 physical damage, I get the bonus from the critical hit multiplier, and I get the bonus 25% damage from Riptide. So, the Archdie, that's where that bonus damage comes into play, and that's not factoring in additional bonuses that might come from certain specials for very specific weapons. But at the basis, you know, that right there is how the damage should be increased by Riptide or by your critical hits. Or if the player happens to be, well, I'll get to that in a second. So that's the basis of how damage might be increased. All right, you're following me so far. Good. The thing about the another status effect that now stands to resistances. So I'll explain it under the current system. I might revise this, but the idea is enemies have a certain resistance to each damage type, whatever those resistances may be. And for damage calculations, it's not a simple, oh, I'll take the damage resistance and subtract it at the end, because of fault line. So the way fault line works is as the fault line buildup increases, the enemy's resistances actually get reduced. And the ratio is 1 buildup point of fault line is equal to minus 0.1% multiplier on the enemy's damage resistances. And that's all the enemy's damage resistances. So going back to our physical damage example, let's say I have an enemy that normally has 20 physical defense, and I'm dealing 20 physical damage. Well, under normal circumstances, I would do nothing. However, let's say I built up fault line to 100. That would mean that the enemy's physical damage resistances are reduced by 10%, or in other words, it's now 18. Now ideal, so it's 20 minus, parenthesis 20 times 1 minus the minus 0.1 or times 0.9. Now all of a sudden I'm dealing damage because the enemy's defenses were weakened. Can enemies absorb attacks? Yes. So if an enemy has damage resistance, so under the new idea for my system, if the enemy has 100% damage resistance to a particular damage type, they are immune to that damage type unless fault line reduces their resistances enough. Does that make sense to the Arch guy? So if an enemy's damage resistance is too high to the type of damage you're trying to deal, you simply will not deal any damage. If you mean, if you're asking the question, okay, Antomicx, might there be certain enemies that could actually regain health from certain damage types? It's a possibility, but again, that's not going to be applicable to the demo, because in the demo, we're in the tutorial area. I'm not going to get super into that level of complexity quite yet. True, the Arch guy. So the way this calculation works is they will never take negative damage to cause healing. So there's a check I do to make sure that if it happens to yield a result less than 0, it just forces it to 0. With the caveat being, if I ever decide to make an enemy type that healed from certain types of damage, then of course I'd have to do a little bit of a different type of programming. But let's not get into that right now. That's not applicable to the demo. That would only be in very specific situations, and only if I decide to go through with that notion. But again, resistances, basically, you have a match resistance, and then you have the fault line buildup. And the fault line buildup dictates whether or not that match resistance is applied, or if it's actually a lesser Exactly, I would hard code that in those situations, and then those would be for very specific situations. Now, you might say, Antomicx, okay, so you have your resistances, you have your bonus damage calculated, we're all good to just subtract, you know, physical hold damage from physical resistance now, right? Wrong. Because we also have the burn and frostbite statuses to contend with. And you might be saying, Antomicx, how does this possibly apply? Well, the thing about the burn and frostbite status effects is anytime you deal fire damage or anytime you deal ice damage, the enemy, assuming the enemy is not immune to that damage type, then the enemy will take a percentage of their max health as damage. And it varies by enemy. So for, like, what I have written here in my notes is for normal enemies, you could probably expect somewhere between 4 to 5% of their max health being dealt as bonus damage. For minor bosses, maybe 1 to 2%, and for major bosses, maybe 0.5% to 1%, around that range. So, what that means is, in addition to everything I just stated about just normal damage calculations, if you're happening to be dealing fire or frostbite damage, then there's also some bonus damage tacked on top of that that's based on the enemy's max health. And you might be saying, Antomicx, you left out one stats effect, and that's because the way Surge works is Surge just increases the critical hit rate for against that particular enemy, so it's, again, you're increasing the percentage chance for the crit multiplier. So, to the Archguy, does that give you a good overview of how damage works without getting into the nuance? Well, no, the Archguy, you have to understand, bosses have a lot of health. So, think of it this way. A cobra, a rattlesnake, I believe has a, like, I think it's 45 health or 50 health, something like that. So that's what you might spend for, like, a super duper weak enemy. A boss could easily have, well, anywhere from 800 to several thousand health if that's a minor boss. And a major boss could easily be pushing into the high thousands to, like, mid 10,000s, or it depends how I want to handle that. But you have to understand, the Archguy, that with bosses they have way more health than a smaller enemy. So even if you say, well, 0.5% against a major boss, isn't that terrible? Not necessarily, because if that major boss has like 10,000 health, 0.5% is 50 damage. That's pretty solid, considering, you know, this rock is dealing 10 damage. Does that make sense to the Archguy? And yeah, the percentage is tweakable, so if I have a certain boss where I'm like, well, I really don't think burn or frostbite should be particularly effective against this boss, I can tweak that down to basically give the player the hint, this isn't really helping you that much. On the flip side, I could actually adjust it to where, well, maybe frostbite's more effective than burn on a particular enemy, or vice versa, just because of certain resistances. So maybe we have like an ice type of enemy. I'm like, okay, they probably wouldn't be that weak to frostbite, but perhaps to burn they'd actually be super weak and might take even more percentage bonus. But that's why I have those percentages there, because you have to understand there's a much larger gap in health between a small enemy and a major boss. And I'm not the only one to use this kind of concept. In fact, in like even Elden Ring, like, the status effects are way more potent against smaller enemies than they are against larger enemies, simply because the larger enemies have so much more health. So, like, against the boss, you know, bleed might deal 7% of the enemy's max health, whereas against a regular enemy, you're usually looking anywhere from like 15 to 30%. It's a lot heavier, and that just all comes back to, you know, gameplay balance. Now, I guess the other thing I would bring up is, you might be saying, okay, Antomicx, you talked about physical, you talked about the elements, what about light? Light is, damage dealt by light actually heals the player. So, if I deal 10 light damage, the player recovers 10 HP. So it's kind of more like you're leeching stuff. So there's no build-up associated with that. It's just the standard, you dealt the damage, you have health back. Simple as that. Anyway, and that in the most general terms is damage calculations in Heartwell. Now we get to write it out. So what I was doing here, yeah, exactly, 100% lifesteal. So the way I've made it work, the Archguy, it's not that I did map it out. It's not that light isn't uncommon, in the sense that, like, there's, I was very careful with how I was, like, I've actually planned out at least general concepts for, like, what the elemental damage types are for each of the 60 weapons that will be in the main game of Heartwell. And I've mapped it out so that pretty much every elemental damage type and elemental combination is about equally dispersed among all the different weapons. So there's close to an equal amount of earth damage dealing weapons as there are light damage dealing weapons, at least at the moment, not including specials, because again, that's going to get into a whole different, that's where things will get a lot more complicated very quick. But excluding specials, just the pure base ideas of the weapons, there's about the same amount of weapons that deal light damage as there are that deal fire damage or deal earth damage or so on and so forth. However, the weapons that do deal light damage are generally take longer to acquire or are heavily weighted to be acquired towards the end of the game. No, the Yoshai. So it's not that they generally do less damage then, it's that the way I've structured the game is that the light weapons are like the rare type of weapons. So you either can't expect to find one unless like thoroughly exploring an area, or some of them might be rewards for like super duper late game. So they're meant to be really, really good because of that life, because light is a life stealing thing and not many enemies resist light. But at the same time, you're not likely to just stumble across it randomly. You'll have to either really thoroughly explore an area to find one, or it might be like a very, very hard behind like a hard boss, or like be a super late game item. So they're still special in that sense. It's just that where you obtain them in the game is, proportional to the relative power of lifesteal. But I want to make it clear that, as useful as lifesteal is, with the different status effects, there's a lot more potential to destroy things quickly by, say, building up like a combination of wind or of headwind or riptide alongside surge and intermixing fault lines on the other statuses as needed. So it's not like light makes everything else obsolete. I think it's more so that it's a different kind of idea. Instead of, whereas all the other status effects are trying to think of how do I destroy the enemy faster, light is kind of the opposite. It was like, how do I survive longer? But it still adds to like the counterplay here of all the different statuses. So about how much health does Dorothy have relative to enemies at any given point? Good question, the Archguy. So, like in Souls-like games, generally against normal enemies, the player will either have more health than them, or about the same health, or slightly less health than them. It depends on how big they are. So if it's like tiny enemy like the Cobra, or Cabrattle or Rattlesnake, of course Dorothy's going to have more health, even at, 0 health, even at like 0 vitality. Against like, tankier normal enemies, they might have more health than a base Dorothy, but if Dorothy invested a lot in vitality, then she might be around the amount of health they have. Minor bosses, depends on the minor boss. In the best case scenario, Dorothy would have to invest a lot in vitality to have the same amount of health as a minor boss. But again, depends on the minor boss. Some will obviously have more health than others. Against major bosses, no. Like, Dorothy's not going to have anywhere near the amount of health as a major boss, even if she had max vitality. Does that make sense to the Archetype? And again, that lines up with Souls-like games. Generally speaking, normal enemies have either less or slightly more health than the player. Minor bosses probably have either about the same as the player if the player's like towards max health or more than the player, and major bosses have way more health. But conversely, you also have to consider that the amount of damage that Dorothy can deal is, like, when she's like super upgraded, you know, could potentially be a lot compared to the amount of damage that a boss might be able to deal to Dorothy. That all ties into like the balancing of how Souls-like games work. Anyway, great questions, the Archdeck. Thank you for bringing these up. Fair enough, KJ Sparks. Yeah, I'm surprised you're still watching that, just because it's like, you're right, that show is a train wreck. It's like, the only reason I would ever watch it is just to try to understand what not to do. That is the only reason I could ever justify trying to watch that. And even then, I would still probably just be antsy to be like, I don't want to watch this anymore, this is awful. But whatever. I digress. Back to damage shouts. So what I was realizing is, we have our max damage dealt calculation here. Yeah, I'm going to have to input this as an important new idea. A new idea. Enemy damage resistances are percentage based. Make sure that even low damage dealing weapons can still I see, KJ Sparks, fair enough. Alright, in that case, it's good you're using it as a basically as an instructionary thing. Makes sense. Alright, I think it's probably a decent place to take another break, so don't worry, guys. I will be right back. Alrighty, chat. Welcome back, everybody. That's what I was saying. We're going to... I think it would be beneficial to actually calculate the damage dealt for each damage type here, so that way we're just summing things up later, and we're also can just tack on frostbite and burn damage at the end. Oh, great question, Katie Swartz. So, they're not like damage over time things, they're more just a set amount of damage. So, let's say I hit an enemy with a fire damage attack. Immediately with that hit, they get a portion of their health dealt as damaged. So it's just like a single hit. So it's think of it as like an extra hit that goes on with your initial hit. So I dealt some burn damage, some fire damage. Alright, burn stats thing. So they would dealt the damage from their burn. So if I were to draw up an equation for that. Well, something like this. Alright, thanks for the look, Crackdoor. I really appreciate it. So let's say burn / frostbite. Damage. Edge is equal to floor. Alright, burn damage is equal to floor. Matt's melee fire damage dealt. Times enemy burn damage times what this is basically saying, TJ Sparks, is did the player deal any fire damage to the enemy? So if the well, actually wait a minute. So melee damage dealt fire. Actually, do I want it to work that way? Yeah, I do think I want it to work this way, because it means that even if the enemy... Well, wait, no. But actually, no, it can still work this way, because for enemies that are truly immune to burn, I just make their burn damage 0. But no, that doesn't make sense. Well, actually, it does make sense. Yeah. Yeah, because some enemies might be immune to fire, but not immune to burns necessarily. Actually, no, it would be the damage dealt. Is equal to... Okay, so the way it works is melee damage dealt to fire. If that's, you know, 1 or if that's greater than 0, then the floor check would set this to 1 and multiply that by the burn damage. However, if the melee damage dealt fire is 0, then the enemy doesn't take any burn damage. Yep. And I personally, as the developer, control what that burn damage is. I tailor it depending on the enemy. And it's the same idea for frostbite damage. And I guess the cool thing about this kind of status effect is for weapons that deal a low amount of damage by default, having that weapon, adjusting that weapon to deal burn or to deal fire or ice damage could instantly increase its DPS because significantly, because you are getting that bonus percentage from the fire or ice. I'm sorry, from the burn or the frostbite. So in this case, we would do melee damage dealt ice, comma 1. As enemy frostbite damage. Okay. Now that we have that, we have all of these thingies. We finally go to not the burn frostbite damage, but the actual damage dealt. So, previous equation, we were subtracting things from things. We can now simplify this to simply an addition of all the damage types. So, damage dealt. We have melee damage dealt total. Is equal to, again, it's just 10 variables. melee damage dealt physical, plus melee damage dealt fire, plus melee damage dealt earth. Plus melee damage dealt electric. Plus melee damage dealt ice. Well, winds. Plus melee damage dealt water. Plus melee damage dealt ice. Plus melee damage dealt light. Plus enemy burn damage taken, plus enemy frostbite damage taken. And while this looks long, in reality it's just 10 variables, it's a simple addition, sums to melee damage dealt total. And we can do the same thing for range damage. And there we go. However, now that I'm looking at this, the way we have to... I think the enemy damage resistance calculation here still makes sense as we're reducing it. However, now it is no longer a subtraction, it's actually a multiplication. We also have to divide that by 1,000, so it's actually a multiplier. So max any damage resistance times ceiling 1,000. Not having any damage resistance percentage. I'll have to do 100 minus that.
Alright. I'll tell you the truth.
Well, then we'll have to divide by 100. Oh well. Basically, what this equation is saying is enemy resistances are percentage based. So, if the max enemy damage resistance were, say, 100, 100 minus 100 is a 0, multiply this all out, it's 0. However, this stat's multiplied out by the fault line buildup, which could reduce the enemy damage resistance.
Remember all the happy times we had?
Yielding a different result.
Very much alike. All right. I'll tell you the truth.
And then we just do our simple addition. And I believe that is everything, since the bonus damage is included here. Okay. And just like that, chat. I know this took a while to write out, but now we have our pseudocode for our damage calc. So critical hit checks, bonus damage, pseudocode, the bonus damage multiplier, shall we say. And yeah. Melee and range damage shot, frostbite, burn, melee. Ranged. Alright. Oh, hi Dropper, we're just working on the damage calculations here. Now that we've done that, alright chat, I'll kind of get your opinions on this. So I know we've been doing a lot of writing tonight. This does take a while to write out and think about. Are you guys okay with ending things a little bit early tonight, or do you want to see me attempt to start to program some of this out? Because that's going to be a lot of just looking in the editor and inputting values. And it is getting just a bit later. I'm confident, though, that with some inputs on this and some potential debugging, we'll be able to make this work. Yeah. All right. You know what? No, I think what we do, I'm going to insert an object that we'll pick up with on next step stream. We will make this object than something very, very easy. This Cobra damage relation object is not visible at the start. It is transparent. We do not destroy the object if too far away from the frame. I'm not using fine dimension. And its only purpose is to give us some multiple values to work with. And this will make this one a different color just so it's a bit differentiated. Make this one green. It might be a bit more obvious if we just made it yellow. It doesn't have to be artsy, the point is just to make it obvious. Edit. Okay. So let's write down the to-do for next the next strum goals. Resolve bugs by implementing the damage calculation. Rework concept. All pseudocode the next I think of what the next step, what date the next dev stream would be. It would be the 11th of August. Okay. All pseudocode is in the 7-28 2022 dev stream notes under ideas. Okay. And the object that will be used Cobra damage calculation object. Which looks like a blue diamond with a yellow center. It is located Alright. I think that'll do. Alright, chat. Well, I know tonight was a bit of a slower stream, definitely a lot of pseudocode, but I feel like we're making progress and heading in the right general direction. I do know that I am definitely on a bit more of the tired side tonight. I know that if I were to just try and sit down and implement the code, it would take a bit longer than I would like. So I'll be wrapping things up here. If you're watching this on Twitch, feel free to stick around for a break, but if you're watching this on YouTube and you like what you saw, please consider subscribing on YouTube. It's free to subscribe on YouTube. You can always change your mind later, and it's a great way to show support. If you're watching on YouTube, I hope you have an awesome night.